Third grade. Detectives in Togas. Chapter 2, A Muffled Groan. The next morning when the boys arrived at school, Xanthippus was not there. This was reason for wonder. Their teacher had never kept them waiting before. They had arrived punctually an hour before sunrise and taken their seats on the benches as they were supposed to do. The slaves had accompanied them only as far as the forum, since they had to go shopping in the markets. Rufus, of course, was absent, and so was Caius. Only Mucius, Julius, Flavius, Publius, and Antonius had shown up, and they could not figure out why Caius was missing. Perhaps he had not done his homework and was playing hooky for that reason, though that would hardly help him. Xanthippus had an excellent memory, especially when it came to punishments. But where could Xanthippus be? Not that the boys were so eager to see him, but it was dull sitting here in silence and staring at the walls. They were cold and sleepy and would much rather have been home in their beds. Their lanterns, which had been placed on the benches beside them, flickered dimly and smelled of burnt olive oil. It was still dusky outside in the gray pre-dawn broad street, and it was lifeless and deserted. Silently, Antonius and Flavius chewed a couple of rolls which they had bought at the baker's on their way to school, since they had left home before breakfast. But gradually the boys became uneasy. Xanthippus' living quarters adjoined the schoolroom, separated only by a thin curtain. If Xanthippus were up, the boys certainly ought to hear him, but all was silence behind the curtain. "He's overslept," Publius said, grinning maliciously. Julius shook his head. "Out of the question," he said. "Xanthippus always gets up before the 10th hour of the night. He told us that himself." "I don't believe everything he says," Publius scoffed. Flavius suggested that Xanthippus might have gone to pay an early visit to Rufus's mother, but Mucius growled, "Rot! Nobody but a schoolboy goes anywhere before dawn. Put out your lantern. The smoke is choking me." Flavius blew out his lantern. Antonius suddenly noticed that Xanthippus' stool lay on the floor, tipped over in the front of this desk. This was puzzling, for Xanthippus always kept the room in perfect order. "Maybe he's sick," Julius said. "What would that have to do with the stool?" Publius asked. "Otherwise he would have picked it up," Julius replied. "We had better go in and see what's the matter with him." Mucius objected. "If Xanthippus is sick, he would have already called us. We'll wait." "All right," Publius yawned. "I'm happy as long as he lets us alone." He stretched out on the bench and made believe he was snoring. The others laughed, but Antonius gave them a fright by exclaiming in a tense voice, "Maybe Xanthippus has been murdered." Flavius paled. He was not much of a hero. Involuntarily, he turned to look at the curtain. "Who would want to murder Xanthippus?" Mucius demanded, realistically. "Lukos," Antonius whispered. Antonius was always one for expecting the worst. His head was full of ghosts and criminals. Every night before going to sleep, he looked under his bed to see whether any burglars were lurking there. But he was always disappointed. His friends knew all about his tendency to imagine things. But this time they were impressed. The mention of Lukos made them all shudder a little bit. Lukos was a famous astrologist and seer. Supposedly he came from Alexandria, the great Greek colony in Egypt. He had turned up in Rome about 2 years ago. All kinds of stories went around about him. He was supposed to have mysterious powers, for he had predicted a great many important political events. Rumor had it that he could also work magic. The boys were fascinated by Lukos because his house stood directly across the street from the school. And they could watch it all the time. It was a gloomy, windowless building made of heavy stone blocks. It towered over the low shops to either side of it. Beside the imposing front door hung a sign on which was written in big red letters, "Lukos, world-famous astrologist, member of the Academy of Alexandria, former personal soothsayer to the king of Persia. Office hours, after sunset. Beggars and peddlers, keep out. Mortal danger." The boys had read the sign again and again, but it thrilled them anew every time they saw it, especially the last 9. Mortal danger. Antonius imagined that Lucas had bodies of at least half a dozen beggars and peddlers buried in the cellar of his house. But the other boys only laughed at this notion. It would be against the law, Julius argued, and even a magician would not dare violate the law. Julius's father was a judge, which was why he knew a lot about law and such matters. Oddly enough, the boys had never seen Lucas. For some reason, the soothsayer seemed never to leave his house. One day during the breakfast recess in school, Antonius had made the bold statement that Lucas never left because he had no legs. This had annoyed Publius, who was fond of contradicting anyhow, and he had objected. Then he would have himself carried by slaves, whereupon Antonius replied, "He has no slaves." That had infuriated Publius. "What silliness," he cried. "Lucas is rich. A consul who was visiting us once said Lucas made millions on his soothsaying. All the big shots go running to him because they can make a lot of money on his prophecies. They pay him plenty. The consul says he even guessed the emperor's secret plans. The emperor doesn't know about it, but the senators and consuls do. It's just stupid to say Lucas has no slaves when every millionaire has at least 100. Why, we've got 200 slaves." "We've got a lot more," Antonius promptly retorted. "We've got 2 slaves for our goldfish alone, but Lucas has no slaves. His father told me so, and he knows better than your consul. Have you ever seen a slave coming out of Lucas's house? Have you?" "No, come to think of it, it's funny," Publius admitted sheepishly. "You see," Antonius triumphed, "no slaves ever come out because there aren't any." Flavius, who had been listening attentively, asked, "But who brings him his food?" "Nobody," Antonius answered readily. "If he gets hungry, he produces a meal for himself by magic." That was much too much for Mucius. "Ridiculous," he snorted. "You can't make food by magic. Lucas probably goes out to eat every night." "Without legs?" Caius exclaimed in astonishment, whereupon they had all burst into laughter. This conversation had taken place several weeks ago. At that moment, the boys were feeling much less gay, meaning happy. And now Antonius had made them feel rather nervous with his silly idea that Xanthippus might have been murdered. Mucius frowned sternly at Antonius. "What made you think Lucas might want to murder Xanthippus?" "Oh, that's easy," Antonius was eager to explain. "Lucas is mad at anything at the school because we always make such a racket. That bothers him when he's trying to soothsay." "That wouldn't be a good enough reason for him to murder Xanthippus," Julius protested. "He hasn't murdered him either," Antonius said. "He's just bewitched him and changed him into a pig, which amounts to the same thing." The others laughed, and Julius remarked, "If Xanthippus had been changed into a pig, we'd hear him grunting in the next room." "He was changed into a deaf and dumb pig," Antonius promptly replied. "There aren't any deaf and dumb pigs," Julius disagreed. They had been arguing about whether or not deaf and dumb pigs existed. Publius, who took an interest in this problem, abandoned his sleeping position on the bench. As he sat up, he happened to glance at the wall behind Xanthippus's desk. "Why," he exclaimed, "the writing tablet is gone." At first, the boys did not understand. Then they realized he meant the tablet on which Rufus had written, "Caius is a dumbbell." What happened to it? Mucius suggested that Xanthippus had probably thrown it away out of annoyance. Julius thought otherwise. He must have saved it to show Rufus's mother as proof that Rufus was to blame for the fight with Caius. "That's right," Antonio agreed. "A mathematician like Xanthippus never does anything without good proof." "Poor Rufus," Flavius sighed, and for a while the boys fell silent. Meanwhile, it had grown lighter outside, but the sun had not yet risen, and Broad Street was still deserted. "Let's go home. There's no sense sitting around here," Publius mumbled. "Quiet," Mucius whispered. "I thought I heard something from the other room." He tilted his head and listened intensely. "There! Do you hear that?" From Xanthippus's apartment came a muffled groan. The boys stared in horror at the curtain.